He was known to many as Aegon Targaryen of Dragonstone, a prince of Valyrian descent with an unbroken lineage and eyes the color of molten amethyst. In another telling of history, he would have become the Conqueror, the founder of a dynasty that reshaped the entire continent of Westeros. Yet, in this version of events, he chose never to launch his fateful invasion. He remained on his lonely isle, content with the scorching breath of his dragons and the swirling sea mists that cloaked his domain. No ravens were sent to demand fealty, no towering swords melted to form the Iron Throne. The Seven Kingdoms continued as they had for centuries, divided under the crowns of different kings, with each realm safeguarding its own traditions and wielding its own proud history. And in that world, the tapestry of power, betrayal, and alliances was woven in patterns quite different from what the realm might otherwise have known. In the quiet haze of dawn, the beaches of Dragonstone would glimmer with black sand, and the menacing silhouette of the castle rose steeply above the shoreline. On crisp mornings, one could catch the silhouette of a great winged beast patrolling the skies, never straying too far from its master below. These dragons belonged to House Targaryen, the last scions of Valyria. Yet, under Aegon's measured leadership, they never soared beyond the stepstones in search of conquest. The realm across the narrow sea, Westeros, remained to him a distant land of fractious lords and ephemeral alliances. Perhaps he glimpsed in it the seeds of conflict he did not wish to sow, or perhaps the tragedy of Valyria lingered too strongly in his memory, warning him not to gamble what little the Targaryens had left. Whatever the reason, the day never came when the longships carried Aegon's banners to the mainland. Instead, he built up Dragonstone, forging alliances across the sea with Pentos and Bravos, content to wait for an opportunity that, for him, might never have truly beckoned. Meanwhile, upon the vast continent of Westeros, many petty wars and proud monarchs shaped the lives of thousands. In the north, House Stark ruled from Winterfell as it had since time immemorial, standing solemn and solitary in their age-old traditions. Their bannermen were fiercely loyal, shielded by the chill winds and treacherous snows from the ambitions of southern crowns. In the Vale, House Arryn kept a watchful eye upon their precariously perched eyrie, their falcon banners fluttering against the high mountain passes that warded their lands. In the Riverlands, House Tully carefully balanced alliances with the Stormlands, the Westerlands, and the Iron Islands alike, for their strategic positioning at the heart of the continent made them vulnerable to any tide of war. House Greyjoy of the Iron Islands, never truly content unless their longships were reaving or trading, continued their salted ways. They answered only to their lords and the seas themselves, finding more advantage in coastal raids than in forging alliances that might bind them to uneasy peace. Farther south, the Reach prospered under House Gardner. The orchards and fields, the vineyards and golden wheat, these were the pride of High Garden, and the sumptuous feasts offered at its tables were legendary. The lords of the Reach measured their power in harvests, nights, and the honeyed words of courtly tradition. Across the desert expanse in the southeastern corner, Dorne stood resolute under the banner of House Martell, its proud traditions and fierce independence unmatched. Dorne, unconquered even in the old days, sustained a wary relationship with its northern neighbors, ever mindful of encroachment and insistent upon being treated as equals. The Stormlands, battered by winds and rain, remained under the iron rule of House Durrandon, kings of storms who boasted a lineage traced to the legendary figure of Durin Godsgrief. On Westeros's western shores, the Lannisters of Casterly Rock counted their gold and kept a watchful eye over the Westerlands, certain of their might but ever eager to extend their influence. At the southwestern extent, the might of House Hightower in Old Town, a city of knowledge and faith, provided quiet counsel to all who sought the Maester's expertise and the Starry September's guidance. No single faction dominated the continent, and countless small wars were waged in the corners of the realm. A border skirmish here, a matter of inheritance there, a dispute over shipping tariffs or farmland or a rich seam of gold in some new-mined hills. Such were the concerns that propelled kings to raise armies and lords to bicker in their halls. Westeros was as it had been for centuries, a patchwork of rivalries stitched together by blood and coin, occasionally undone by betrayal. Even so, None of these lords or kings had reason to suspect that a flame-haired Targaryen might one day cross the sea to unify them all with blood and fire. The Targaryens, it was rumored, lingered in their fortress of black stone, biding their time or simply determined to remain aloof. Many believed the last scions of Valyria had grown too few in number to risk a major conquest. Some, whispering in taverns and backroom gatherings, argued that the Targaryens must have lost the secret of controlling their dragons, or that perhaps their beasts were not as numerous as rumored. But in truth, on Dragonstone, Balerion the Black Dread was far from a myth. He, along with Vagor and Meraxes, remained perched in slumber, the three monstrous harbingers of a possible conquest that never came. Aegon rose each morning to see them fed, to train them, to ensure their fires remained stoked. His sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, each had their own part in these daily rituals, forging a bond of respect between Targaryen and dragon that few alive in the world could understand. They practiced aerial maneuvers above the sea, always within sight of Dragonstone's towers, never pressing farther west than the painted table's instructions might have once suggested. Their ambition simmered beneath the surface, but for reasons known only to their private councils, they never set the seas aflame. In the absence of this conquest, the fortunes of Westeros twisted in unexpected ways. There was, for a time, an unspoken competition among the great houses to rise above the rest. Rivalries that might have been snuffed out by a united crown continued to smolder. The Storm King in the Stormlands saw the Vale as a rival for maritime influence, as the Arryns occasionally tried to expand their fleet and presence in the Narrow Sea. The Ironborn eyed the western coasts of the Westerlands and the mouth of the Mander, hoping to seize gold and farmland. House Gardner and House Durrandon might form uneasy alliances based on trade or marriages, only to have them unravel over points of pride or expansions of territory. House Lannister, flush with gold and wealth, began forging deeper ties with the Faith of the Seven in Old Town, seeing in the Starry Authority a potential ally to buttress their claims of moral righteousness. The Gardner kings frowned upon the Lannisters' attempts to create an alliance with the Hightowers, for that would elevate Lannisport and Old Town both, overshadowing the agriculture-driven grandeur of Highgarden. Here, knights and lords performed a dance of politics and personal ambition, each seeking to elevate themselves or their liege. The Reach, though flourishing in farmland, always had to keep an eye on the Dornish to the south. The border conflicts between Dorne and the Reach remained heated. Some harvests were lost to Dornish raids, and in turn, Reach lords would occasionally venture across the Red Mountains to burn fields belonging to the Martells. Without a single iron throne to unify the realm, retribution and vengeance ran freely, with each lord insisting upon his right to claim what was his, or to repay stolen harvests with interest. In this ongoing strife, the small folk who toiled in fields or labored in cities were often the ones to suffer the brunt of war's cruelty. Though not every conflict was large, the persistent tension resulted in raised taxes, forced levies, or the occasional demands for forced labor to repair walls or fortify keeps. Corruption and cruelty were not foreign to Westeros, but they were magnified by the lack of any overarching authority that could compel reluctant peace. The High Septon in Old Town might preach the virtues of the Seven, urging the kings and lords to set aside pointless bloodshed for the sake of their souls. But those words rarely found purchase in a land shaped by swords and sovereignty. Each king saw himself as rightful master of his domain, subject to no higher mortal power. Among these warring kings, a few individuals began to earn a reputation that stretched across the borders of their realms. King Arlen V. Durrandon, for instance, was said to be a formidable figure with a keen strategic mind. He had a talent for forging temporary alliances that allowed him to strike unsuspecting foes. His expansions into the Dornish marches set him at odds with the Martells, even as the Storm Kings had once warred with them centuries before. Eager to secure a lasting legacy, King Arlen sealed marriage pacts with lesser lords in the Reach, promising them a share in the spoils if they would ally with him against any future threat from Dorne or the crownlands. Yet always, the crownlands near the Blackwater remained an uncertain place, nominally under the influence of whichever king was strong enough to claim them, but never truly stable. Occasionally, some rumor of Targaryen involvement would arise, whispers of Aegon's envoys traveling in disguise to propose an alliance or test the local lord's loyalty. But these rumors never bore fruit, and the Storm King paid them little heed. To the west, King Gerald Lannister, known as the Golden Lion, expanded trade routes from Lannisport to the free cities of Essos. Fleets of merchant vessels regularly crossed the narrow sea, returning with silks, spices, and occasionally goods from far-off lands that dazzled the nobility of the Rock. Gerald Lannister viewed commerce as a weapon as sharp as any sword. By controlling trade with the East, he could exert influence over the smaller houses of the Westerlands, ensuring they remained dependent on his benevolence for wealth. He also found a willing partner in Old Town, for the Hightowers welcomed this increase in maritime activity. This partnership worried the High Septon, who feared that Old Town's closeness with the Lannisters might threaten the independence of the faith. Yet for the moment, gold poured into the coffers of Casterly Rock and Old Town alike, ensuring that both sides remained content to let the arrangement stand. Dorne continued to defy the ambitions of its neighbors through cunning, desert warfare, and the unyielding spirit of House Martell. Prince Corran Martell was a master of subterfuge, preferring to weaken his foes through infiltration and diplomacy before any open war. Dornish envoys traveled widely, from the Arbor in the southwest to the Vale in the northeast, forging small alliances that might hamper any large host from crossing the Red Mountains. Word spread that some Dornish lords were even in communication with the Targaryens on Dragonstone, hoping to court their dragons as a deterrent against invasion. A rumor persisted that Corran Martell had managed to secure a private audience with Visenya Targaryen off the coast near the Broken Arm. Though the details were elusive, the idea of a Dornish prince forging ties with Dragonstone fueled both fear and curiosity across Westeros. Yet no dragons appeared on Dornish skies, and the scorpions along the Dornish border walls saw no monstrous silhouette to shoot from the heavens. The North, in contrast, remained vigilant but largely removed from these southern squabbles. Torrhen Stark, then king in the north, found the intrigues of the southern courts tiresome. His bannermen were proud men: Umber, Manderley, Karstark, Bolton, each content to guard their own domains against wildlings from beyond the wall or skirmishes near the neck. Many northerners believed the wars to the south hardly mattered to them, unless some ambitious southern king marched an army to Moat Cailin. That crossing, however, was formidable to any would-be conqueror, and with no Targaryen impetus to unify the entire continent, no single southern power could muster the forces needed to bring the north to its knees. This isolation suited the Stark kings, who found it easier to unite their region in proud self-sufficiency than to meddle in the ephemeral alliances below the neck. Amid this tapestry of competing crowns, the faith sought to maintain a semblance of moral authority. Many among the Septons believed that the Seven intended the realms to come together for the greater good. Yet lacking the hammer of a unifying monarchy to drive home their doctrines, their influence was more limited. In corners of the continent, the old gods still held sway, or Lawler found new adherents, or the drowned god commanded the hearts of the Ironborn. Some small folk believed that, had the Targaryens taken Westeros with fire and blood, the faith of the Seven would have grown stronger, if only to oppose the threat of dragons. But in the absence of any great conqueror, the faith itself divided into factions: those who supported one king or another, those who held to the neutrality of the High Septon, and those who saw the potential for forging new power centers from Old Town to King's Landing, if indeed King's Landing could ever truly be called a city under a single monarch. For in this version of history, King's Landing did not exist as the capital it would have been. It was a modest coastal settlement with no particular significance beyond its strategic location near the Blackwater Rush. Various kings or warlords had controlled or contested it, but none had built it into a grand seat of power. Such a seat of power was precisely what Aegon Targaryen might have created, had he come with his sisters and dragons. Yet time passed, and no Targaryen banners lined the shores of the Blackwater. In the minds of most, the Targaryens were reduced to a rumor, an old solitary house perched on an island fortress with a rumored arsenal of living flame. A few intrepid merchants who traveled to Dragonstone returned with accounts of tall, pale-haired warriors and dark castle corridors lit by dragonfire. But for many in Westeros, the Targaryens became a distant myth, a shadow of Valyria whose power, if it existed, was kept in slumber. Yet Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys were not idle. Their caution did not mean they never contemplated the possibility of future expansion. They simply refused to commit to open war, preferring to quietly gather wealth, knowledge, and alliances. Through spies and messengers, they monitored events in Westeros. They listened as the lords quarreled, as alliances formed and broke, as the Storm King pressed into the crownlands, as the Lannisters grew wealthy, as the Martells manipulated southern politics, and as the Starks stayed aloof. More than once, Visenya proposed that they might conquer at least a portion of the continent, seizing perhaps the crownlands or the stormlands, letting the other realms watch in terror and scramble to surrender. Aegon's response was measured. Such an act might unify all the other kings against them. Rhaenys, on the other hand, harbored a fascination for the Reach, for its songs and chivalry and the scenic beauty said to be found in the fields of golden wheat. She pondered if a subtle approach, allying with House Gardner through marriage or trade, might pave the way for the Targaryens to establish a foothold. Yet even she hesitated to push forward. Perhaps they feared that a united Westeros would rally behind a shared cause if threatened by dragons. Or perhaps they relished their independence, unburdened by the endless duties that would come from ruling a vast realm. In the meantime, the lords of Westeros had begun to notice a series of well-appointed envoys who traveled in plain garb, bearing no sigils, yet possessing a certain regal bearing. These envoys negotiated trade deals, offered gold for shipbuilding services, or inquired about the cost of hiring sellswords. One after another, they quietly disappeared into the night, leaving behind only cryptic remarks. Some suspected these were Targaryen agents, collecting information and building a network of influence. Yet no one could be absolutely certain. Dragonstone, for all its rumored secrets, rarely gave anything away. Its walls stood as silent sentinels against the swirling sea, and the Targaryens themselves were known for their close-guarded pride. While the Targaryens watched, cracks began to form in the delicate balance of Westeros. The Storm King's ambitions did not go unnoticed by the other monarchs, nor did the Lannisters' rising commercial empire. An alliance, albeit an uneasy one, formed between Highgarden, the Vale, and the Riverlands, aimed at limiting Lannister expansion and containing the Stormlands' aggression. Representatives from House Tully traveled to Riverrun to meet with Mace Gardner, the king's cousin, renowned for his diplomatic skill, and a delegation from House Arryn. Their plan was to create a series of mutual defense pacts. If the Storm King or the Lannisters attacked one of them, the others would come to their aid. It was a bold move, for centuries of rivalries and border feuds had made trust elusive. Yet fear often forges alliances where love does not. Upon learning of this pact, King Gerald Lannister seethed with fury. He saw it as an attempt to undermine his rightful place as the wealthiest monarch in Westeros. He summoned his bannermen in a grand council at the Rock, where golden tapestries lined the hall and casks of the finest arbor wines were offered to appease the lords. Over days of feasting and strategic discourse, he convinced his vassals of the need to strike first, to ensure that the alliance being formed to the east and south never became more than words on parchment. Meanwhile, King Arlen V. Durrandon perceived that if the Lannisters were to war against the Riverlands and the Reach, it might be his chance to cement his hold on the Crownlands and possibly subdue some portion of the Blackwater region. He sent out ravens to his allies, instructing them to prepare for a major conflict. Mercenaries from Essos were discreetly hired. New ballistae were forged to counter the rumored threat of dragons, just in case the Targaryens decided to intervene. The realm braced itself for a war on a scale unseen in a generation. As these tensions escalated, the Starks in the north made it clear they would not be drawn into the conflict unless directly provoked. The Greyjoys, always seeking plunder, began raiding the western coast, preying on merchant ships laden with Lannister gold and goods. House Hightower of Oldtown, which had been drifting closer to Casterly Rock in trade and faith, found itself squeezed by demands from Highgarden to remain neutral, or else suffer the consequences of turning the might of the Reach against them. The Dornish, smelling opportunity, increased their presence in the Dornish marches, watching carefully for any sign of Lannister or Stormlander armies crossing the Red Mountains. All of Westeros seemed poised on the knife's edge. Word spread like wildfire. The greatest war in a century was about to erupt. Those small folk who could afford to flee did so, taking their families deeper inland or to more secure castles. Others prepared for the storm by stockpiling food or praying fervently to the Seven. Knights polished their armor, sharpened their swords, and made final adjustments to their horses' saddles. The ravens flew day and night, carrying tidings of alliances made and broken. Skirmishes and bandit raids multiplied, hinting at the greater conflicts to come. In many a lord's solar, the painted table or a hand-drawn map replaced the usual trappings of feasts and tapestries. Men pored over them by candlelight, seeking advantage in the many passes and fords that crisscrossed the realm. Against this looming catastrophe, the Targaryens remained curiously silent. Some believed that with war set to rage across Westeros, House Targaryen might at last strike, arriving as a third force to exploit the chaos. Others thought the Targaryens would hold to their usual aloofness, content to watch the kingdoms tear themselves apart. Whispers of a secret marriage alliance between a Targaryen princess and a Dornish prince circulated, while other rumors insisted that Visenya was preparing to wed one of the Highgarden lords, forging a new line that would outmaneuver both Lannisters and Stormlands. None of these rumors bore fruit in the immediate sense, but they stirred fear and speculation, fueling more frantic preparations among the warring kings. When the first official blow was struck, it came from the Westerlands. Without a formal declaration, Gerald Lannister's armies marched east into the Riverlands under the cover of night, crossing the Red Fork near Fair Isle with surprising swiftness. Caught off guard, House Tully scrambled to muster its forces. The seat of Riverrun prepared for siege, its storied moat closing around its walls to keep the Lannister host at a distance. The Lords of the Trident, outraged at this sudden invasion, rallied their banners, but the Lannisters had already seized a swath of farmland and smaller towns, plundering supplies and burning anything they could not carry away. Refugees fled east, seeking safety near Harrenhal or the other great keeps of the Riverlands. The Hightowers, uncertain whether to join the conflict, contented themselves with fortifying Old Town and maintaining trade ties, at least until they could see which side was likely to prevail. In response, King Mern Gardner dispatched a force led by his cousin Mace to reinforce House Tully. The Knights of the Reach were famed for their discipline and chivalry, yet they found themselves confronting not just Lannisters, but also Ironborn Reavers who had taken advantage of the chaos to raid the western coasts. Meanwhile, King Arlen V. Durrandon marched his own forces north, seeking to lay claim to the crownlands and potentially encircle the Riverlands from the south. The Vale, tied by alliance to the Tullys and the Gardeners, began preparations to send forces by ship around Cracklaw Point, hoping to outflank the Stormlanders. The realm descended into a conflagration of battles, raids, and sieges. From the siege of Riverrun to the skirmishes in the Dornish marches to the naval clashes between fleets of the Vale and Stormlands, Westeros was ablaze with the wrath of rival kings. In the midst of this carnage, the Targaryens made their move. They did not arrive with a host of dragonfire raining down upon hapless armies. Instead, they deployed small, nimble warships brimming with mercenaries, capturing the stepstones and fortifying them. From there, they leveraged control over the maritime routes connecting the Narrow Sea to the Summer Sea, effectively controlling a critical passage for trade and troop movements. When King Arlen sought to move additional troops by sea, he found Targaryen galleys blockading the straits, demanding exorbitant tolls. When Lannister and Gardner ships attempted to ferry goods to distant ports, they, too, were forced to negotiate. Suddenly, the kings of Westeros realized that while they battled each other on land, the Targaryens had seized control of the seas. Aegon Targaryen, from his vantage on Dragonstone, observed the unfolding chaos with calculated calm. He had no intention of placing himself at the head of a large land army, which might unite the fractious kings against him. Instead, he sought to become indispensable to each side, offering or withholding access to shipping lanes as it suited him. While armies clashed at the borders, the Targaryens grew rich off the passage tolls, ransoms, and tributes they demanded. This was a quieter conquest, a subtle infiltration into the bloodstream of commerce and warfare. They sold supplies to both sides, carefully balancing the scale so no single kingdom could gain such an advantage that it might crush the others. This arrangement suited Aegon's design. So long as Westeros remained divided, House Targaryen could profit immensely without risking a direct confrontation. Yet the presence of dragons still loomed. When a Stormlander fleet attempted to force its way through the Stepstones without paying the toll, Visenya Targaryen descended on Vhagar, setting their flagship aflame and sinking several galleys in a matter of minutes. The horrifying display of Draconic might serve as a reminder to Westeros that the Targaryens, despite never having invaded the mainland, were still the ultimate power if they chose to flex their wings. After this demonstration, no one dared challenge the blockade openly. Instead, kings and lords tried to negotiate with Aegon, sending envoys to Dragonstone with chests of gold or promising alliances. In turn, Aegon would allow certain shipments through or relax the tolls for a time, ensuring that each realm relied on him in some capacity. The war dragged on, but with every passing month, the Targaryens grew more entrenched as maritime power brokers, their dragons ensuring no one could break their grip at sea. Amid the prolonged conflict, the small folk of the realm suffered terribly. Famine and disease became rampant in the Riverlands, as the once fertile breadbasket was ravaged by incessant battles. The Vale's fleets clashed repeatedly with Stormlander ships, resulting in countless lost sailors and disrupted trade. In the Westerlands, the mines continued producing gold, but caravans struggled to transport it safely amid roving bandits and opportunistic skirmishers. Even the Reach, normally so bountiful, felt the toll of war as men were called to arms and fields were left fallow. The Faith attempted to broker peace, calling for a grand council in Old Town, but the kings were too consumed by their ambitions to concede anything that might weaken their positions. Prince Corin Martell of Dorne watched from afar, dispatching small raiding parties across the marches when it suited him, but never committing a full invasion. He understood that as long as the southern borders remained unsettled, the Reach could not fully devote its armies northward. If the war dragged on long enough, perhaps House Martell could extract concessions from Highgarden, maybe even reclaim territory lost centuries before. The labyrinth of alliances and enmities stretched across the land, leaving every region waiting and watching, hoping to outlast the others. Eventually, even the resilient lords of the realm began to tire. Years of war had consumed their youth, bled their treasuries, and tarnished their hopes for unchallenged sovereignty. Some in the Riverlands began to question whether fealty to one of the major powers might offer relief. The Tullus, battered by repeated Lannister incursions, sought new ways to bolster their defenses. House Blackwood and House Bracken resumed their ancient feud, further dividing the region. Meanwhile, the Vale found its resources strained. Winter snows often choked the high passes, leaving them dependent on maritime supply routes increasingly controlled or taxed by the Targaryens. At times, the Arryns found themselves paying more gold to Targaryen toll collectors than they had intended to spend on the entire war. In hushed corridors, lords and ladies asked each other, "Was it not better that we once prayed for a single crown to rule us all?" But no such crown was forthcoming, nor did Aegon Targaryen show any eagerness to place it upon his head. In the 7th year of the war, a brutal winter fell upon the land. The cold winds blasted the north, and the freeze even traveled as far south as the Reach, where frosts damaged the citrus trees. Roads turned treacherous. Armies could not easily march. Harvests were lost, and famine spread. The seas became storm-racked, forcing even the Targaryen ships to remain closer to sheltered coves. Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes did not fear the cold, but the Targaryens themselves found little profit in pressing the advantage during this season of hardship. They contented themselves with sending out fewer patrols, consolidating their garrisons in the Stepstones, and maintaining a skeletal blockade. Meanwhile, the kings of Westeros retreated to their hearths, battered and defeated by the elements as much as by each other. Stark, Tully, Lannister, Gardner, Durrandon, Arryn, Martell. Each felt the bitterness of a war that had cost far more than it had ever promised to yield. When the snows receded, and spring began to hint at a return, the realm found itself on the brink of collapse. Weakened by years of conflict and a harsh winter, many lords could barely afford to keep their knights. Others teetered on the edge of rebellion, resentful of their king's relentless ambition and empty promises. The Targaryens, untouched by the ravages of war on Dragonstone's black shores, continued to play the part of neutral arbiters, charging tolls and quietly amassing a fortune. It was during this fraught period that a new figure rose to prominence in the crownlands. Rosby Celtigar, a lesser noble who claimed descent from a Valyrian bloodline. He was rumored to have visited Dragonstone and dined with Aegon Targaryen personally. Upon returning to the mainland, he declared that the crownlands would no longer suffer the yoke of the Storm Kings or the predations of any other realm. He purportedly carried letters of support signed by Aegon himself, though the authenticity of these letters was never fully verified. Whether by Targaryen design or pure opportunism, House Celtigar raised a small army of crownland lords who were desperate for peace and stability. Their ranks swelled with sellswords and peasants alike, men who wanted an end to the constant shift in overlordship. In a matter of months, the Celtigar-led force seized several key castles along the Blackwater, ousting Stormlander garrisons that had been left weak and undersupplied after the long winter. The sudden emergence of a self-declared prince of the Crownlands caught the attention of every monarch in Westeros. They turned their gazes to Aegon Targaryen, suspecting his hand behind this new claimant. Yet the Targaryens offered no direct statements, no clarifications of their involvement. Kings raged in their halls, exchanging raven-sent threats and demands. But after years of war, no realm had the strength to mount a full-scale campaign to reassert control over the Crownlands. The Storm King attempted a punitive expedition, only to see his battered forces turned away by the newly fortified castles under Celtigar's control. Some believed House Celtigar was receiving secret shipments of weapons and gold from Dragonstone. Others argued that the Targaryens were using Celtigar as a puppet, a test to see if the realms could be subdued piecemeal. But no conclusive evidence came forward. What was certain, though, was that the man styling himself as Prince Rosby Celtigar successfully negotiated trade agreements with the Vale, the Riverlands, and even a handful of ports in the Reach, offering favorable terms that circumvented the Targaryen tolls. This threatened to undermine the Targaryens' maritime monopoly, prompting them to tighten their blockade around the Stepstones and the Gullet. Tensions flared anew. Desperate to re-establish their hold, the Storm King considered open war against Celtigar, but his allies wavered. The Lannisters refused to lend support, busy dealing with their own rebellious lords who were sick of constant warfare. The Gardener King was wary of diverting men and resources away from pressing concerns at his southern borders, lest the Dornish seize the opportunity. The Tullus were occupied with the rampant banditry that had flourished in the chaos of war. House Aaron sent only a handful of knights, more as a gesture than a real commitment. In effect, the Storm King was left to face this new threat on his own, weakened by a decade of conflict, his once proud banners stained by defeat. After a series of inconclusive skirmishes, the Stormlanders withdrew, leaving House Celtigar in de facto control of the Crownlands. For the small folk who had endured endless shifts in power, the new arrangement meant some semblance of stability, though it was unclear how long that might last. Far from these daily struggles, on the basalt throne of Dragonstone, Aegon Targaryen waited. Visenya and Rhaenys, each with their own council, continued to advocate for different courses of action. Visenya believed the time had come for a swift, overwhelming strike. The realms were exhausted, their armies depleted, their treasuries bankrupt. A single demonstration of draconic wrath might topple them all. Rhaenys countered that such a move might unify the kingdoms in their desperation, forcing a last alliance that could still threaten Targaryen fortunes. Aegon listened carefully, aware that the fragile state of Westeros could either be exploited or wasted. Perhaps it was enough to profit from the chaos. Perhaps it was destiny for House Targaryen to rule a unified continent. Such thoughts tugged at him, day after day, as he paced the high battlements of Dragonstone, feeling the salt wind whip at his cloak. Across the narrow sea, the free cities also watched the developments in Westeros with growing concern. Bravos and Pentos, once courted by Targaryen coin, now realized that House Targaryen was maneuvering to become a dominant maritime power. The Bravosi, famed for their sea captains and cunning bankers, considered intervening in Westeros to limit Targaryen influence, though they hesitated to challenge dragons directly. Pentos, too, understood the precarious balance of power. The Targaryens had forging or neglected alliances in that region for years, and if they solidified their grip on the stepstones, they could threaten the shipping lanes to Slaver's Bay, undermining the trade of Essos. A new dimension of complexity was thus added to the conflict, for the merchants of Essos had gold aplenty to hire sellsword companies on a grand scale. As spring turned to summer, the patchwork hostilities in Westeros flared up once again. The renewed fighting lacked the ferocity of earlier years, but it was enough to keep everyone on edge. Skirmishes broke out near the Golden Tooth as Lannister vassals tried to reassert dominion over rebellious lords. A new incursion by Stormlander forces into the crownlands was repulsed by Prince Celtigar's men. Some claimed with covert Targaryen assistance. Dorne launched another series of raids across the marches, and the Reach responded by sending an army to fortify the Boneway. All the while, the Targaryen blockade at the Stepstones tightened its grip. Supplies that once flowed freely were now subject to taxes paid to House Targaryen, building Dragonstone's coffers ever higher. Small folk in every region grew weary and resentful. They took little solace in the complexities of high politics and alliances. What mattered was that their fields were trampled, their sons conscripted, and their daughters left to beg in the streets of half-ruined towns. Some began to whisper, in hushed tones, of a different possibility, one that had never fully manifested in the realm's history. They whispered that perhaps one king, even if he came on the back of a dragon, might be preferable to the endless cycle of bloodshed. Better to pay fealty to a single conqueror, however cruel, than to be forever crushed between the competing ambitions of many. The wheel of power ground down the people of Westeros with its constant turning. But that king did not come. Aegon Targaryen showed no sign of crossing the sea with his host of dragons. Rumors circulated that perhaps his caution had turned to cowardice, that the Targaryens feared the combined might of a desperate Westeros. Others believed that Aegon's subtle approach had already made him the de facto ruler of the waters, that he could manipulate events on the mainland without ever placing a foot upon it. Even as the continent choked on the dust of perpetual war, the notion of a Targaryen invasion remained a specter, not a certainty. The great houses continued to struggle among themselves, each hopeful that victory might still be snatched from the jaws of ruin, or that a strategic marriage or alliance might tip the balance in their favor. Yet change often comes not from grand designs, but from a sudden shift or stroke of luck. And such a stroke came one autumn, when a plague swept in from the east, likely carried by ships from Essos that had slipped past Targaryen checkpoints. This plague, called the Shivering Death by the small folk, spread rapidly through the battered towns and camps of the warring armies. Lords and peasants alike succumbed to its fevers and chills. The Storm King lost a beloved nephew. The Lannisters saw entire garrisons decimated. In the Riverlands, the Tully heir perished, leaving a leadership vacuum. House Gardner fared somewhat better, but the disease still took many of its knights. Even Dorne was not spared. The plague ravaged the ports of Sunspear before spreading inland. The Vale, protected by its mountains, suffered fewer casualties, but trade disruptions led to shortages that caused unrest among the people. Everywhere, the disease fed on a population already weakened by war and malnutrition. The plague was indiscriminate, but it had a profound impact on the political landscape. Armies lost their capacity to wage further campaigns. Castles had to quarantine themselves to prevent the spread of disease. The faith found itself overwhelmed with the sick and dying, undermining its ability to mediate or lead. Lords who survived were left to contend with drastically reduced manpower and wealth. In this weakened condition, many realms finally opened to the possibility of negotiated settlements. Perhaps there was no shame in agreeing to partial treaties and boundary concessions if it meant preserving what little strength remained. Thus, envoys from multiple kingdoms convened near Maidenpool, a location chosen for its neutral standing and partially intact infrastructure. Over the course of weeks, they hashed out a series of armistices and truce agreements. Borders were redrawn, ransoms were set for prisoners of war, and certain trade routes were reopened. While far from a true peace, these treaties offered a chance for the war-weary realms to lick their wounds. The negotiations were tense and complicated, and at times threatened to fall apart. But the memory of the Shivering Death, which still lingered in many a coughing fit and fresh grave, encouraged compromise. Another wave of plague could sweep through at any moment, and no realm wanted to be caught in a state of perpetual war if that happened. Throughout this entire process, the Targaryens hovered on the periphery. They sent observers to Maidenpool, who neither insisted upon any demands nor offered any concessions. The Targaryens continued to collect tolls at sea, albeit at slightly reduced rates to encourage the battered realms to resume trade. Westeros was too weak to challenge the blockade, and Aegon Targaryen seemed content to maintain the status quo, an uneasy armistice on land and Targaryen dominance at sea. Over time, a battered sense of normalcy returned to the continent. Harvests were replanted, towns slowly rebuilt, and some measure of trade resumed. Many knights and soldiers turned to the mercenary life, or else returned to their lands to become farmers once more, compelled by survival rather than honor. The various kings continued to style themselves with regal titles, but the aura of invincibility was long gone. Their subjects had seen too much death, too many broken promises, to truly trust in any grand monarchy. Instead, the lords ruled by necessity, forging local pacts and alliances that kept some semblance of order. The Targaryens, for their part, thrived as maritime overlords. Their coffers never emptied, and their island stronghold was left unmolested. They still had dragons, Valyrian, Vhagar, Meraxes, and a small but well-trained force of knights and men-at-arms. For the time being, they chose not to press for further dominion. Their dominion was the sea itself, the lifeblood of trade and communication in the known world. That proved enough, at least for now. As the years rolled on, the children of these kings and lords inherited realms scarred by the memory of a devastating conflict. Some took a more diplomatic approach, forging cross-realm marriages to prevent another cataclysmic war. Others sought to quietly build their armies, lest the day come when the Targaryens decided that a divided Westeros was ripe for the taking. Small pockets of rebellion flared here and there, led by those who believed their grievances had never been addressed. But by and large, the land settled into a resigned acceptance of the new order. Multiple kingdoms, loosely tied by fragile truces, haunted by the knowledge that beyond the narrow sea, the Targaryens watched, waiting for the moment they might choose to strike. Still, the grand story did not end. The legacy of that near-endless war would echo through generations, shaping the politics, culture, and faith of the continent. Bards spun tales of the days when Westeros bled itself in petty ambition, ignoring the dragon lords who hovered just out of reach. In some corners, the small folk came to revere the Targaryens as the ones who had mercifully stayed their hand, choosing not to reduce castles to ash and bone. In others, they cursed the Targaryens as vultures who profited off the misery of the warring kings. The truth, as always, was far more complicated. Aegon Targaryen's decision not to invade Westeros, to remain on Dragonstone, shaped a continent in ways no one fully understood. Had Aegon followed the path many believed fate had laid out for him, Westeros might have been unified under one banner, forging the Iron Throne from the swords of vanquished kings. Peace might have been enforced by Dragonfire, and the realm might have grown strong under Targaryen rule, though perhaps at the cost of countless lives in a brief but intense period of conquest. Instead, Westeros endured a prolonged era of fragmentation, war, plague, and uneasy truces, forging stories of heartbreak and heroism, greed and desperation, that would be told and retold in every corner from the last hearth to Sunspear. The Targaryens' dragons still soared in the skies above the narrow sea, but they never descended in total conquest. Instead, they hovered like watchful sentinels or opportunistic ravens over a land that could neither unify fully nor splinter beyond the possibility of redemption. In the hush of Dragonstone's grand hall, Aegon Targaryen would sometimes stand at the painted table, tracing a single finger along the outline of Westeros's coasts. He would pause at the Vale, at the Reach, at the Westerlands, at the North. He knew each region's strengths and weaknesses, its unfulfilled potential, its hidden dangers. He envisioned how easily the dragons might subdue them, how swiftly the lords might bend the knee under the scorching presence of Balerian's fire. Yet he also remembered the tales of Valyria's doom, the cataclysm that had swallowed an empire thought to be eternal. Empires rose and fell. Dragons lived and died. Perhaps House Targaryen had learned caution where others saw only glory. Perhaps the name Conqueror was not the only destiny for him. In this world, he was Aegon of Dragonstone, master of the Narrow Sea, whose choice not to invade would reverberate for generations. Uncounted years later, maesters would puzzle over the question in their histories. Was Westeros better off divided, or would a swift conquest have spared it generations of suffering? Their scrolls and tomes would present arguments for both sides, analyzing the short-term devastation of continuous war versus the possibility of an equally brutal but quicker unification. They would note the ascendancy of the Targaryens at sea, the resilience of regional identities, the stalemate of power that allowed for smaller voices to occasionally emerge. They would remark on how House Celtigar rose to unexpected prominence in the crownlands, shaping an entire new polity that might have been impossible under a single iron-fisted rule. The songs sung by minstrels in taverns, however, would paint different pictures. Some would lament the never-ending wars among petty kings, wishing for the day a single dragon lord had come to unify them under one throne. Others would celebrate the independence and variety of the Seven Kingdoms, with each region free to chart its own path, forging alliances or waging wars as suited their nature. Such songs would speak of love across kingdom lines, heroic stands against tyranny, tragedies of plague and famine, and the ever-present threat of dragons that never quite arrived to shape their fate. And the Targaryens themselves? They endured, generation after generation, guarded by black stone walls and monstrous winged shadows. Their wealth grew, their knowledge deepened, and their bloodline remained pure, though even they could not escape the slow erosion of time. In due course, the children of Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys would ascend, each with their own ideas of what might be done with dragons and ships, gold and glory. Perhaps one of them would launch the conquest their forebears never did. Perhaps one would sign a grand alliance, uniting Westeros through marriage rather than war. Perhaps another would simply continue the policy of controlling the seas, letting the mainland devour itself in periodic bursts of conflict. So many paths stretched out from Dragonstone, so many possibilities left open by that one pivotal choice, to remain rather than to invade. In the end, the realm would never be the same as the one we know in stories of the Conqueror. There would be no single Iron Throne, no Targaryen monarchy that centralized power. Instead, the Seven Kingdoms trudged onward as a loose mosaic, each piece distinct in culture and loyalty, rarely trusting neighbors but begrudgingly relying on them in times of crisis. Dorne remained proud and free, forging alliances and repelling invasion. The Reach continued to bloom with chivalry and harvest, though always watchful of Ironborn raids and Lannister ambitions. The North stayed isolated, proud, and cold, seldom venturing south unless forced by necessity. The Vale soared above the clouds in stoic independence, while the Riverlands bore the scars of a war-torn past. The Iron Islands reaved when they could, traded when they had to, never forgetting their salt-born traditions. And the Stormlands, battered but unbroken, clung to their legacy of defiance against any storms, literal or metaphorical, that battered their shores. For generations, travelers would sail past Dragonstone, gazing in awe at the forbidding spires where dragons roost. They would speak in hushed voices of the Targaryens, that strange, silver-haired family with eyes like gemstones and the power of dragons at their beck and call. Some sailors swore they saw the shadow of Balerion, or later another monstrous beast, soaring above the clouds at dawn. Others claimed to have glimpsed Targaryen princes or princesses walking the black sand beaches, discussing the fates of kingdoms as one might discuss the day's catch. Yet no matter how many times the Watchers of Westeros peered across the sea, waiting for the sails of a dragon-led invasion, it never came in Aegon's lifetime. The painted table remained only a blueprint of what might have been, as the realm continued to shape itself without the forging fire of a Targaryen conquest. Such was the world that grew from a single choice. Aegon Targaryen never crossed the sea to conquer Westeros. In the cracks and crevices of fractured kingdoms, new stories blossomed. Heroes rose and fell, villainy flourished or was stamped out, and a tapestry of alliances wove itself anew, generation after generation. Yet always, somewhere in the background, the question lingered. What if the dragons had come? Would the realm have found unity under one throne, or would it have burned to ash and bone? None could say for certain. The only certainty was that Westeros had been spared that day of reckoning, left to forge its own path through struggle and survival, with Dragonstone forever watching across the sea, dragons perched on its ramparts, their fire a memory of Valyria's doom, their potential conquest an echo of what might have been and, perhaps, what one day might still be.